The first thing my daughter heard that morning wasn't my voice. It was a stranger's, shouting into a phone camera that a retired firefighter had just pulled a school bus driver out of the Cedar River before the current took the whole vehicle under. My name is Walter Cobb. I'm 61 years old, and 3 hours earlier, my own daughter had told me to figure out my own way home from her mother's memorial. For 39 years, I loved a woman named Ruth. She kept our house full of noise, grandkids underfoot, a radio always on in the kitchen, casseroles for every neighbor who so much as sneezed. I was the quiet one. I fixed what broke and stayed out of photographs. Ruth used to say I was the kind of man nobody worried about, because I never gave anybody a reason to. That should have been a compliment. It turned out to be the reason nobody thought to check on me. 4 days before all this happened, I stood over Ruth's grave in a cemetery outside Cedar Falls, Iowa, the town where her sister still lived. Ruth had spent her last 2 months there, close to her sister, and to a specialist who'd given her more time than the doctors in Ohio ever could. I drove the 6 hours back and forth every other week. Some weeks it felt like the only thing keeping me upright was the white line on I-80. The morning she passed, there was no drama to it. Just her hand going still in mine sometime around dawn, and a nurse quietly stepping out to give me the room. We buried her 3 days later. Small service like she'd have wanted her sister, a few of her church friends, the smell of lilacs because that's what she'd always planted along our fence line. Afterward, I stood by the grave until the groundskeeper, a young guy with kind eyes, told me they needed to lock the gates soon. "Take your time," he said. "Nobody's rushing you." "I appreciate that," I told him. "But I think I've been standing here trying to figure out how to leave my own wife behind, and there's no amount of time that fixes that math." I drove myself to the little regional airport the next morning. One duffel bag, still wearing my wedding ring because taking it off felt like a second funeral. Ruth used to grip my hand on takeoff every single time, 40 years of flights, and she'd always say the exact same thing. "If we go down, Walter, I want it noted I forgive you for the timeshare in Branson." I'd laugh every time like it was the first time she'd said it. The seat next to me on that flight home was empty in a way that had nothing to do with the airline's booking chart. We landed in Columbus a little after 4 in the afternoon. I stayed in my seat while everyone else stood and shuffled for the overhead bins. There was no reason to hurry. Nobody was standing at the gate for me. Ruth used to be the only one who ever waited at arrivals instead of just texting "here" from the parking garage. I opened the family group chat. Me, my daughter Diane, my son Marcus, Marcus's wife Priya, and a scattering of cousins who mostly used it to post grandkid photos and 4th of July plans. I typed, "Landed? Anybody able to swing by and grab me? Little tired for the bus today." I looked at that message a long time before I hit send. I've never liked asking my own children for anything. 40 years of being the guy who didn't need help, and here I was, hoping somebody would offer before I had to ask twice. The message showed delivered. 2 minutes later, Marcus wrote back, "Kids have practice, sorry. Bus 21 runs right by the airport. Should only be like 40 minutes. I stared at that. A bus. 40 minutes. My wife had been in the ground for exactly 3 days. Then Diane's message landed underneath it. "Dad, honestly, you probably should have just booked something quicker so it wasn't rush hour. We all have stuff going on today. Should have booked something quicker. Like grief ran on a train schedule. Like burying the woman who raised both of them could have been squeezed in before soccer practice if only I'd planned it better." My thumb hovered over the keyboard a long time. I could have told them I just watched their mother's casket lowered into red Iowa clay. I could have told them I hadn't slept a full night in 6 weeks. I could have said a lot of things. Instead, I typed 2 words, "No problem." And I put the phone in my jacket pocket, not because it wasn't a problem, but because I finally understood something Ruth had tried to tell me for years. You cannot make people show up for you. You can only decide how you'll carry it when they don't. Outside the terminal, Columbus gave me a gray sky and a cold wind coming off the river. Families hugged at the curb. Kids ran circles around rolling suitcases. A driver leaned on his horn at nothing in particular. The whole world kept moving exactly like it always had. Mine had just stopped and started over as something smaller. I wheeled my bag toward the bus stop signage, my knees aching in that deep way that had nothing to do with the walking. While I waited, I noticed an older woman across the way struggling to wrestle a rolling suitcase up onto the curb, her cane hooked over one wrist. "Let me get that for you," I said, and lifted it before she could argue. "Bless you," she said. "I hope somebody's just as kind to you today." I smiled the way you do when you don't trust your voice not to crack. I hope so too, ma'am. That's when the sound hit metal folding into metal. A horn stuck blaring. Somebody screaming two words over and over. The bus! The bus! Everybody's head turned toward the access road that ran along the river bridge just past the airport exit. A school activities bus must have been coming back from some regional tournament, had clipped a guardrail after a delivery truck jackknifed in front of it, and the whole back half of the bus had gone through the rail and was hanging half over the embankment, nose down toward the swollen Cedar tributary that cut behind the airport grounds. Kids were screaming inside. I could see small hands pressed against the back windows. People froze. Phones came out. A couple of men shouted for someone to call 911. I'd spent 26 years on a volunteer fire department before my knees gave out and forced retirement on me. Instinct doesn't retire with you. I dropped my bag and ran. Sir, don't that thing could go in the water any second? Someone grabbed my sleeve. Then somebody better be already in it, I said, and pulled free. The bus door was jammed at an angle, half crushed against the guardrail post. I could hear the driver, an older man, dazed, blood on his forehead, trying to get kids to move toward the front. Water was already lapping at the back windows. I found a length of pipe railing that had sheared off in the crash and used it to lever the door enough to squeeze a shoulder in. One at a time, hands on my arm, don't look down. Just walk to me, I kept saying, again and again, voice steadier than I felt. Small hands, then bigger ones, then a coach half carrying a girl with a twisted ankle. Behind me, I could hear the bus groaning against the guardrail, metal complaining under its own weight, water rising by the second. The driver was the last one out, and he was the one who couldn't walk. I got an arm under him and half dragged him up the embankment just as the back tires finally lost their grip on the crumbling shoulder, and the whole bus slid the rest of the way down into the water with a sound like the whole world. Exhaling. By the time the first fire truck arrived, we were all on solid ground, soaked, shaking, 12 kids, a coach, and a driver who kept saying my name like a question because I'd told him during the pullout, out of habit, the way you do when you're trying to keep somebody conscious and talking. Walter Cobb, stay with me now. A police officer took my information on the shoulder of the road, said I ought to get checked out at the hospital. I told him I'd had worse from a chainsaw kickback in 2003, and he laughed despite himself and said something about how every man over 60 says exactly that. Then I said, without really planning to, I buried my wife 4 days ago, and his smile fell away, and he just nodded and said, then you've had about the week nobody deserves, sir, and let me go, without pushing further. A local news van showed up not long after one of those quick regional affiliate crews chasing the police scanner. A young reporter, maybe 30, introduced herself as Angela Reyes with Channel 10. She asked if I'd answer a few questions. I told her I really wasn't interested in being on television. She said several of the kids' parents were already asking who'd pulled their children out. I said that was between me and God and didn't need my name attached to it. She looked at me a second, then nodded like she respected that more than she'd expected to, and let it go. Because the access road was closed for the wreck recovery, a police cruiser gave me a ride to a nearby extended stay motel where a few stranded travelers were already checking in. Small room, thin carpet, a window that looked out over a gas station sign. For the first time all day, it was quiet. I unpacked Ruth's good Navy cardigan from the side pocket of my bag. She'd insisted on packing it for the flight to Iowa. Even though she never once put it on, said it was for in case, the way she packed for everything, including apparently her own funeral trip. It still smelled like her rosewater perfume. I sat on the edge of that motel bed holding it, and that's when I finally cried, not over the bus, not over my hands, which were scraped raw from the pipe railing, but because there would never be another Sunday phone call from Ruth asking if I'd made it home safe. Across town, my children had no idea where I was. Marcus had just sat down to dinner with Priya and their son when his phone started buzzing a neighbor first, then an old army buddy, then his own supervisor. Marcus, turn on Channel 10 right now. Why, just turn it on. The footage was already looping a helicopter shot of the wreck, then a phone video some bystander had posted, grainy but unmistakable. A gray-haired man in a canvas jacket, wedging open a bus door with a piece of pipe, pulling kids out one by one while the bus tipped further toward the water behind him. Priya went pale first. Marcus, that's your dad's jacket? Marcus couldn't get words out. He just stared. Across the city, Diane got almost the identical call from her sister-in-law. She laughed it off at first. No, seriously, turn on the news. Until she did, I did. And the anchor was saying the words retired volunteer firefighter and identified as Walter Cobb of Reynoldsburg, and Diane had to sit down on her own kitchen floor. Then the station ran the follow-up angle. Some producer had clearly dug up fast flight records. A screenshot pulled from a public post about the memorial service in Cedar Falls. The timeline laid out plainly. Cobb had landed back in Columbus only hours after burying his wife. Diane's hand went to her mouth. She thought about her own text. You probably should have just booked something quicker. My phone stayed face down on the motel nightstand all night. I didn't feel it buzzing. I didn't want to. I woke before 6 the next morning, and for a few merciful seconds I forgot everything. Forgot I wasn't home, forgot Ruth was gone, forgot the river and the bus and my scraped hands. Then I reached toward the other side of the bed and found nothing but cold motel sheets, and it all came rushing back at once. I finally checked my phone around 7. 31 missed calls. Dozens of texts. Marcus, Dad, where are you? Please call me. Then, 20 minutes later, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Diane's messages weren't much softer in tone, but just as frantic underneath. Dad, please, just tell me you're okay. Please don't shut us out. I didn't answer either of them, not out of spite. I just wasn't ready to talk yet, and I'd learned by then that grief doesn't care whose timeline it interrupts. Meanwhile, at 7 that same morning, Marcus and Diane met outside the house I'd shared with Ruth for 36 years, the house where they'd both grown up. Marcus let them in with the spare key I'd given him years ago for emergencies. Ruth's reading chair still sat angled toward the window. My old work boots were lined up by the garage door, exactly where I'd left them. The coffee maker sat cold and unused, and that alone nearly broke Diane, because their mother had never once let that machine sit cold in 40 years. We should clean up before Dad gets back, Diane said, mostly because it gave her hands something to do besides shake. While straightening the hallway closet, she found a shoebox tucked behind the winter coats, tied shut with kitchen twine, Ruth's handwriting across the lid, for when you're both ready. Inside weren't journals exactly, they were cassette tapes. A dozen of them, each labeled with a year, going back almost 15 years, alongside an old handheld recorder Ruth had bought at a yard sale because, as she used to joke, some things sound truer out loud than they read on paper. Diane found the recorder's batteries had corroded, but Marcus remembered their late uncles had the same model gathering dust in the garage. It took them 20 minutes to get it working. The first tape they played was from 6 years back. Ruth's voice filled the kitchen, warm and a little tired, clearly recorded late at night. Marcus doesn't know his father sold the boat to cover the difference on the house down payment. Told him the bank came through with better terms. Walter made me swear not to say anything. Said a gift with strings isn't really a gift. Marcus sat down hard on a kitchen stool. They kept listening. Tape after tape, year after year, the same pattern, quiet sacrifices dressed up as coincidence. Ruth's voice explaining how I'd picked up part-time consulting work at 63, not because I missed working, but because Diane's ex-husband had left her with debt neither of them knew I'd quietly help cover. How I'd put off replacing my truck for years because Marcus's oldest needed a procedure the insurance wouldn't fully pay for. How I never once mentioned any of it, not once, in 15 years of tapes. Then came the newest one, recorded only weeks before she passed. Ruth's voice, weaker now, unmistakably hers. The doctor in Cedar Falls said there's one more option worth trying. Walter didn't even ask the cost before he said yes. I watched him sign the withdrawal forms for what's left of our savings with his jaw tight the whole time, and he still made a joke about it after, so I wouldn't worry. If I don't make it, I need my children to understand his quiet was never coldness. It was the biggest heart I ever got to love. Diane put her face in her hands and didn't try to stop the crying this time. Around noon, Priya arrived carrying groceries and found them both wrecked at the kitchen table. She read 3 of the tape transcripts Marcus had scribbled down and had to sit for a minute herself before she could speak. I told him to take the bus, Marcus said, voice raw. 4 days after his wife's funeral, and I told him to take the bus like he was some coworker running late. What matters now, Priya said gently, is what you do when he walks back through that door. That evening, I finally drove myself home in a rental car, since my own truck had been sitting in long-term parking the whole time, exactly where I'd left it before the funeral trip, no magic to it, just a detail nobody had thought to ask about yet. The porch light was on. Two lawn chairs sat out front that hadn't been there before. Marcus in one, Diane in the other, neither one looking at a phone, both of them standing the second my headlights hit the driveway. Nobody said anything for a long moment. Then Marcus stepped forward. "Dad, let me get your bag." I almost said I could manage. Instead, I just handed it to him, and it hit me that the last time he'd carried a bag for me, he'd been about 10 years old. Diane made coffee inside, using Ruth's percolator, following her handwritten recipe card. "It's not as good as hers," she admitted, half laughing through tears. "Nothing ever will be," I said. "That's all right." We sat at the same kitchen table where Ruth had hosted 40 Thanksgivings. No television on, no phones out, just the smell of burnt coffee and the low hum of the refrigerator. "We found Mom's tapes," Marcus finally said. "I wondered when that day would come. You let us find them. They were your mother's to give, in her own time, not mine to hand you." Diane wrapped both hands around her mug. "I keep thinking about my text. Dad, I am so sorry. I've never meant anything less in my life than you should have planned better. You can't take it back," I told her. "But you get to decide who you become because of it." Marcus stared into his coffee. "That reporter at the scene, she asked if we knew you were flying back that day. You could have told her everything. Could have let the whole state see exactly what we said to you." "I thought about it," I admitted. "For about 4 seconds. Why didn't you?" "Because your mother spent 40 years teaching me that shaming somebody in public doesn't heal anything in private. It just gives everybody something to feel superior about for a news cycle." The room went quiet again. Diane finally asked, "Were you angry with us?" "Furious?" I said, and for the first time all week, I actually laughed a little. "But I've had 39 years of practice not saying things while I'm angry. Your mother used to say I disappeared into the garage to organize hardware whenever I needed to cool off." "You weren't organizing anything, were you?" Marcus said slowly. "Not one bit. I was just waiting until I could open my mouth and have something kind come out of it." A few days later, the three of us drove out to the small memorial garden Ruth had picked years ago, overlooking a stretch of the Scioto River she'd always loved for its walking trail. We stood there with white lilies, the wind moving through the trees the way it does in early spring. "I'm sorry, Mom," Marcus said quietly. "I forgot how much you both were carrying so we wouldn't have to." Diane just nodded, unable to speak yet. I set the flowers down and told them the only thing I really knew for certain. "I spent most of my life teaching you both how to walk. I never once thought about what it'd take to teach you how to walk back." Marcus broke down completely then, the kind of crying that has nothing performative in it, and wrapped both arms around me the way he hadn't since he was a boy afraid of a thunderstorm. Diane joined in, and the three of us stood there under those trees for a long while. And for the first time since the funeral, I didn't feel entirely alone in the world. That whole season shifted after that, slow the way real healing is slow. Marcus started showing up Saturday mornings with 2 coffees, no reason given, no favor needed. "Figured yours be cold otherwise," he'd say, and I'd tell him he figured right. Diane started calling just to ask what I was doing that evening, not because she needed something, and my answer was usually something small: mowing, fixing the porch step, or just missing your mother out loud for a while, which she never once flinched from hearing. My grandson Caleb, Marcus's boy, wandered into my garage one Saturday and asked if I could teach him how to build something. 3 words that filled up a space in me I hadn't realized had gone hollow. We spent the whole afternoon on a birdhouse that came out crooked at the end. "It's not perfect," he said, frowning at it. "Neither is any family," I told him, tapping the little lopsided roof. "But if the foundation's solid, it'll still stand through the weather." A month later, the fire department that had trained me 30 years back asked me to speak at a community safety night. I almost said no, never did care for a microphone. Then I remembered something Ruth used to say. If your life can be useful to somebody else, it stops being just your own story to keep quiet about. So I went. Near the end, a young father in the crowd asked what made me run toward that bus instead of away from it. I thought about it a moment before I answered. My wife spent our whole marriage teaching me that the people you love don't get extra minutes back once they're gone. So when somebody needs those minutes, you stop asking if it's safe, and you start asking if you can live with yourself if you don't try. The room was quiet a long time after that. Then slowly, people stood up. Not for me, because they understood exactly what I meant. On what would have been Ruth's 63rd birthday, The whole family gathered in the backyard, Marcus grilling burgers the way I'd taught him, Diane's attempt at Ruth's apple pie coming out just slightly wrong, in a way we'd all quietly agreed to love anyway, the grandkids running wild between the rose bushes Ruth had planted with her own hands. As the sun started going down, Marcus stood up with his glass raised. "I spent years thinking taking care of my family meant a paycheck and a roof," he said, voice unsteady. "I forgot my family included the man who spent his whole life quietly making sure we never had to know what he'd given up. I can't take back that text, Dad, but I promise you'll never again wonder if somebody's coming to get you." Diane reached over and squeezed my hand. "Neither will I." I looked around that table at my children, my grandchildren, and the one empty chair we'd left on purpose, not because we thought Ruth was sitting in it, but because some love doesn't need a body present to still take up space at a table. "Your mother would have loved this," I said. Marcus laughed through tears. "She'd have told us the burgers were burning." Everybody laughed at that, and it felt like something coming back to life. Not because the grief was gone, it never fully leaves, but because for the first time in a long while, there was enough room at that table for joy to sit down right next to it. I've come to understand, at 61, that families rarely break apart because of one terrible moment. They wear down slowly, through small, unanswered calls and postponed visits, and the quiet assumption that there's always going to be another chance to make it right. Sometimes there isn't. If this story reminds you of somebody who's still waiting on you to pick up the phone, don't wait for a headline to make you notice. Call them today. Go see them while you still can. The greatest thing we ever give the people we love was never the money we saved for them in silence. It was simply our time, spent out loud, while there was still time left to spend it.